Good morning, San Diego. And good morning. Hey. I know most of you, but just in case, my name is Nancy Jameson. I'm the Executive Director of San Diego Grantmakers. And today we are here in usual good spirit with our San Diego fellow grantmakers, but we're also being transmitted across the country through the miracles of live stream. So we are keeping our fingers crossed that the technology works, and we feel that's like a little bit of a miracle thing going on here. But we are excited to have you all here and all you folks that are watching across the country as well. The mission of San Diego Grantmakers is to connect, educate, develop, and inspire organized philanthropy to be more effective individually and collectively. And today we hope to do all of those things here and across the country. So on behalf of the staff and the board of SDG, that's what we call ourselves, and the other two regional associations of grantmakers who are partners in this, Northern California Grantmakers and Southern California Grantmakers, we are thrilled to have the speakers we have today, everybody here and everybody joining us through this miracle of live streaming. Grantmakers from other regional associations across the country, and particularly in California, are offering this. People in Iowa and Illinois and Michigan and Missouri and the Pacific Northwest are joining us. And that's a testament to technology, but it's also a testament to our speakers, that they incite and inspire that kind of interest. So we're hoping it works. Most of our participants today are grantmakers, and I will remind those that wear multiple hats, that we don't do fundraising in this space, that we are a grantmaker hat that we're wearing. In addition to being a miracle today related to the technology, it's also sort of about a dream coming true. Now, that sounds a little bit dramatic, but I have daydreamed about this over the years since I have heard both of these gentlemen speak separately. I thought that they would be excellent sparring partners, verbal sparring partners, and I'd wanted them to have them here in San Diego for a while, and I'm happy that the stars have aligned and they are here today. My sense is that they will be a dynamite combination. I hope you've seen their bios online, so I'm not going to go in detail on that, but I'll briefly say that Aaron Dorfman, who's you're far on the right. Far left on the right. And we did not plan that, by the way. He is the Executive Director of the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, which works to ensure that grantmakers are responsive to the needs of those with least wealth, opportunity, and power. They are a progressive watchdog, research, and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. Among other accomplishments, Aaron spent many years as a community organizer in national networks and was a former student of Senator Paul Wellstone. He speaks and writes about liberal values in philanthropy, diversity, advocacy, organizing, and transparency. His sparring partner today is also from Washington, D.C., is Bill Schambra, the director of the Hudson Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. The Bradley Center aims to encourage foundations and charitable donors to direct more resources toward support of small, local, often faith-based grassroots associations that are the heart of a vital civil society. The Bradley Foundation, the center's principal donor, is a prominent funder of public policy research, supporting free enterprise, traditional values, and a strong national defense. Bill has an impressive background bio, but to mention two things, he was a director at the Bradley Foundation and a senior advisor to U.S. Attorney General Edwin Meese. Bill is an oft-quoted voice for what is referred to as conservative philanthropy, something we'll learn more about today. Our moderator, who's sitting over there at the moment, is Sid Voorakkara, someone who's well known in San Diego philanthropy circles. He is a former program manager with the California Endowment, a former board member with San Diego Grantmakers, former chair of our public policy committee, and now a consultant with the newly formed and very cleverly named 10-page Memo, something I'm sure Sid would never write. We are happy to have recently engaged him at San Diego Grantmakers to help with our program offerings this year, so you'll be seeing more of Sid, and we're happy to have him. So we have talked in the past, in our workshops and in our newsletters, about why it is so important to really listen and be open to differing perspectives in philanthropy, to listen to all of those around us, to nonprofits, to community members, to political leaders, to business, to academia, and to each other. Today we will listen to two articulate experts in the effective practice of philanthropy that have very different lenses and belief systems, both of which we can all learn from. These traditions of philanthropy are not necessarily as explosively opposed to each other as certain political leaders are today in our country. Bill and Aaron seemed to get along just fine on the phone when we talked. Nevertheless, we may have some fireworks now and then this morning, and we're looking forward to that. So I will briefly explain our structure. We'll have introductory remarks from both speakers here at the podium. They prepared sort of their opening forays, if you will. We did a coin toss in a political debate tradition, and Bill will go first. Sid will then then they'll respond to each other a little bit, have a chance to just chit-chat sitting over there about what they just heard from each other. And then Sid will come up and be a moderator of a few questions that we have prepared in advance. Then you have these blue cards, those of you in the room, and a couple points we'll ask to collect them, and I will kind of go through them and, based on the time we have, ask some of them. And also the live stream folks will have an opportunity using this live chat option that they can see on their screen to type in questions, and I'll take a view of those as well. So we'll do our best to address as many submissions as possible. I presume we won't be able to do everything, but we'll do our best. And there's tweeting involved here for those of you that tweet, which I was happy to take a shot at last week. I didn't know what the heck I was doing, but I tried. And if you're doing it, you use the hashtag civil discourse. And then finally, today, there will be a video prepared of the live stream, and that will be on our YouTube channel a couple days from now and accessible to whoever wants to see it. I think that is it in terms of my opening comments, so I will turn it over to Bill Schambra.
Well, good morning, San Diego, and our millions of viewers over live stream. Your program committee is to be commended for tracking down and smuggling into California a creature that hasn't been seen in these parts for quite some time, a conservative. I should warn you, though, that you're obliged to return me to Washington undamaged, because we're almost as unique there as we are here. I begin today with a modest claim. At no time in recent memory has philanthropy been held in such low regard by those who determine its fate, the policymakers in Washington, D.C. And I would add that philanthropy fully deserves that low regard. Consider this. The President of the United States, himself fully cognizant of the virtues of philanthropy as a former Foundation board member, has repeatedly attempted to reduce the charitable tax deduction in spite of vehement protestations from the Foundation world. Consider further that during the presidential campaign, Mitt Romney proposed a general cap on tax deductions that would surely have fallen most severely on the charitable deduction. Adding insult to injury, during the recent negotiations over the fiscal cliff, the future of the charitable deduction was tossed about almost cavalierly as just another pawn in the political chess game, as just another pesky loophole for the wealthy that probably should be closed in order to collect more tax revenue. This is a far cry indeed from the almost hallowed status the deduction seems to have enjoyed in past times. Ironically, only after wealthy and powerful foundations had spent vast sums of money on equally wealthy and powerful K Street lobbyists was Congress reminded that, in fact, philanthropy isn't at all about the wealthy. It's about the poor. After all, the argument went, it was the poor and their nonprofit representatives who would suffer most directly from a diminished deduction. How could Congress have forgotten this fact? I would suggest it's because philanthropy itself has forgotten this. It has forgotten that for all the diverse and worthwhile purposes it pursues in America, ultimately philanthropy should be about the poor. Unhappily, it recalls this truth about itself only when visions of revenue windfalls begin to dance in congressional heads. Both conservative and liberal philanthropy, I would argue, are guilty of forgetting this truth in their fierce and unrelenting ideological struggle over the issue of big versus small government, a struggle that shows no sign of abating. Ironically, both sides insist that the well-being of low-income people are at stake in this struggle. Let me begin with the conservatives in the spirit of removing the log from my own eye before going after that mote in Aaron's eye. Aaron is the son of a preacher, so he would appreciate that reference. Conservatives argue for a smaller government, of course, smaller federal government. They do so not only because it might mean a more vigorous marketplace, but also a more robust civil society. Civil society, not government, is the best instrument to meet the needs of low-income people in this view. For poverty all too often results from the breakdown of the critical social and cultural institutions like family, neighborhood, and voluntary associations, the mediating institutions that shelter and nurture the most vulnerable among us. When big government begins to assume that function, conservatives argue, it only further erodes civil society while doing a woefully inadequate job as a substitute. But if this argument is valid, then conservative philanthropy should accompany its opposition to big government with a massive commitment to big civil society. That is, its central function should be to support and strengthen mediating institutions in low-income communities. This must be its particular responsibility if, as it hopes, private charity and civic institutions are to take back some aspects of the care of the vulnerable from bureaucratic and inefficient big government. Now, many of you may never have heard this version of the argument for smaller government, although Joe Jacobs, I know, wrote a book entitled Compassionate Conservative that made something very much like this argument. But you may not have heard that argument because the other argument for smaller government, the notion that it would liberate the energies of individualism through its marketplace to produce greater wealth, tends to dominate conservative discourse. For that argument brings with it a far more formidable array of allies, wealthy individuals and corporations and their libertarian-leaning think tanks, journals, and activist nonprofits. In the libertarian view, civil society tends to disappear, because once government is reduced, the marketplace can take care of the rest. There is no intermediate layer between oppressive state and free individual in the libertarian framework. So conservative philanthropy, in this view, needn't be wasted on civil society. Rather, it should be devoted entirely to winning the intellectual and political battle for smaller governments and freer markets by funding think tanks, activist nonprofits, and quasi-political campaigns. This was the brand of conservatism fully on display in the election of 2012. No wonder a majority of voters felt that conservatism cared only about the wealthy and not at all about the vulnerable. Now, turning to Aaron's moat. Liberal or progressive philanthropy likes to tell itself that it supports big government precisely because it is committed to the needs of low-income Americans. But it too has taken its eye off the ball. If government were big and getting bigger, as it is indeed, because the poorest among us are benefiting, that would be one thing. But we know that's not what's happening. Our substantial domestic budget now, and increasingly in the future, will be devoted to Social Security and Medicare for the elderly, many of whom are not poor, to interest on a rapidly growing public debt, and to funding retirement and health care benefits for public sector employees. Entirely aside from the mean-spirited savagery of conservatism, which is no longer consulted much about such matters, especially in this state, indisputable budget realities themselves mandate that direct spending for the poor will decline while we struggle to meet our entitlement obligations. I don't have to remind Californians that some of your city governments face bankruptcy, not because they're bending over backwards to help low-income people, but rather because they're paying for government programs that have precious little to do with the poor. Liberal philanthropy has, over the past decade, devoted itself more and more to advocacy on behalf of greater government spending. Its limited resources can't do much to solve problems directly, so the reasoning goes, but it can mobilize the much more substantial resources of government for that purpose. But indiscriminate support for more spending today only means that foundations end up carrying water for the wealthy elderly, powerful public sector unions, well-paid government employees, and other distinctly non-poor constituencies that have powerful vested interests in public spending. For liberal philanthropy to be true to its professed end of serving the poor, it should not just lobby generically for more spending. It should also become much more particular about where that spending goes. It should begin to search for ways to redirect government spending away from the professional providers of services to the impoverished themselves. But to wage this battle on behalf of the poor may well mean that progressive philanthropy has to take on some powerful traditional political allies who tend to elbow aside the poor in the struggle for shares of government spending. It seems then that conservative philanthropy has lost sight of the poor in its struggle for a smaller government, while liberal philanthropy has lost sight of the poor in its struggle for larger government. So when philanthropy argues that Congress shouldn't reduce the charitable deduction because it would harm the poor, it should rightfully feel a pang of conscience. It's just not clear that philanthropy is doing all that well by the poor as it is. Behind these failures, though, I think there's an encouraging possibility. Over the years, I've been struck by the degree to which Aaron and Rick Cohen and other of my friends, Jan Masuoka out here, California, other of my friends on the left, tend to admire precisely the same sorts of nonprofit leaders that I admire. Scrappy, self-sacrificing, outspoken grassroots champions of low-income communities who organize their neighborhoods to work on their own behalf, doing for themselves what they can and applying political pressure where necessary for the resources to do more. I might tend to emphasize what such groups can do for themselves, and NCRP might emphasize what such groups should demand rightfully from others. But there is, I would maintain, a surprising degree of overlap. So here's the hopeful possibility. In the future, conservative philanthropists will have to grapple a bit with their libertarian free market allies in order to restore the civic institutions so important to the poor. And liberal philanthropists will have to grapple a bit with their well-heeled public sector allies in order to redirect spending to the poor. As both brands of philanthropy have to question some traditional alliances, though, perhaps it's time for us to turn to each other in some non-traditional alliances. Such alliances would not require abandoning core principles. Conservative philanthropy will always be more sympathetic to the market, liberal philanthropy to government. But on the critical importance of vigorous, aggressive, grassroots civic groups for low-income communities, I think we can agree and work together. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And thank you, Nancy, for hosting us and for that kind introduction. And thanks to San Diego Grantmakers and all the California regional associations for sponsoring the live stream event today. Conservatives and progressives have fundamentally different worldviews, which color their understandings of philanthropy and its role in a democratic society. Generally speaking, conservatives approach the world individualistically and believe that success hinges on personal responsibility and drive. Conversely, progressives generally have more collectivist perspectives and believe that we're all in this together. We saw these competing worldviews on display in the presidential election campaign all last year, and again during the fiscal cliff negotiations in November and December. And we'll undoubtedly see them on display again in the coming weeks during discussions about gun control, immigration reform, sequestration, and other important issues. President Obama's recent inaugural address was a powerful demonstration of the "we're all in this together" philosophy. He spoke about how preserving our individual freedoms ultimately requires collective action, and he urged us to move forward together. So how does this relate to philanthropy? Well, I propose that there are three things that America needs from its grant makers at this moment. And while these three things may usually be associated with a progressive worldview, I believe that my recommendations will resonate with many grant makers regardless of political persuasion. We're living in an "we're all in this together" moment in history, and foundations need to change if we hope to achieve real results. The first thing our communities need from our grant makers is for foundations to be more intentional about who benefits from philanthropy. It's undeniable that changing demographics are remaking America. As we all know, people of color will comprise a majority of our population by 2042. And increasing numbers of people report being of mixed race or of two or more races. And many grant makers seek to benefit entire communities without regard for race or gender or other factors. They seek to help everyone, and that's laudable. But to ensure that everyone benefits, grant-making strategies need to be targeted because some strategies help certain groups yet leave other groups behind. For example, say your foundation wants to help kids in a particular community be more technologically savvy. And say you provide laptops for every child in that community. Sounds like a great idea, right? But kids whose parents can't afford wireless internet access service at home are going to get far less benefit from your philanthropy than the more advantaged kids will. And you won't actually be helping those who most need the help. Universal programs are limited in their impact if the strategies don't explicitly address the conditions of the most underserved among us. This concept, and I know many of you in the room are familiar with it, is called targeted universalism. We have universal goals, but use targeted means to achieve them. And the power of a targeted grant-making strategy is that if it succeeds in improving those who have been historically marginalized, it helps not only that group, but has ripple effects that also benefit the broader community. A good example of targeted universalism in action is curb cuts, where the sidewalk dips down at the corner to meet the road. Curb cuts became widespread because disability rights organizations, many funded by foundations, fought for them. People in wheelchairs who wanted mobility needed society to make it possible for them to use sidewalks safely. But we all benefit from curb cuts at some level when you think about it. When I'm rolling a heavy suitcase, I sure appreciate the benefit of a curb cut. And so the targeted intervention was designed to benefit one underserved group, but it benefits not only that group, but the rest of us as well. We're all in this together. So that's the first thing America needs from grant makers, greater intentionality, to pay attention to who benefits and to consider race and income and gender and sexual orientation and other factors in our grant-making strategies. Doing so will make us a whole lot more effective than we have been. Second thing America needs from its grant makers is for us to be bolder and to increase our funding for high-leverage strategies such as advocacy, community organizing, and civic engagement. strategies that promote long-term change in complex systems and problems that foundations are seeking to address. This is essential for effectiveness because philanthropic dollars are extremely limited relative to the scope of these problems. A report that NCRP released last year titled Leveraging Limited Dollars, based on a rigorous multi-year project, shows that for every dollar foundations and other donors invest in advocacy, community organizing, and civic engagement, communities reaped $115 in benefits, a truly incredible return on investment. Advocacy campaigns funded by foundations have increased access to health care, expanded educational opportunities, secured protections for the environment, and more. But even with the tremendous freedom given to American grant makers, why are the majority of us so timid in our funding? The data doesn't bear out what Bill was saying, that grant makers have rushed to support this kind of advocacy. In fact, our research shows that only about 15% of grant dollars in the total are dedicated to high leverage strategies like these. One sign that I do see as promising is that we have seen an increase in the number of funders that are devoting at least a quarter of their grant dollars to high leverage strategies like advocacy and community organizing. And so I think that growth in the number of serious advocacy funders may indeed lead to growth in the aggregate totals in the near future as well. Now, it's no surprise to anyone in this room that conservatives generally want smaller government, as Bill alluded to. And Bill has criticized our advocacy studies by alleging that we're just measuring advocacy that promotes bigger government. But he's wrong about that. Authentic grassroots organizing and civic engagement is about making government more responsive to the people. It's not about making government bigger, it's about making government more accountable. Let me give you an example from our study in Pennsylvania that we did. The state's Medicaid program there at the time would exclusively reimburse women for births in a hospital. But a grassroots campaign, partially funded by foundations, wanted to give women more choices, specifically the ability to use midwives for birth at home. The campaign won, and now women in Pennsylvania have more choice. Good outcome, right? But it probably cost the government a lot of money. Actually, no. It saves the government tens of millions of dollars every single year because midwife-assisted births are actually far less expensive than hospital births. So an advocacy campaign benefits women, gives them greater choice, and saves the taxpayers money at the same time. We're all in this together. So that's the second thing America needs from philanthropy. More grants for grassroots advocacy and community organizing of this type that really makes government accountable and responsive to communities. Third thing that our nation needs from the grant-making community is for us to really align ourselves firmly on the side of those with the least wealth, power, and opportunity. Income inequality is the highest it's ever been. According to the Congressional Budget Office, over the last 30 years, the top 1% of earners has doubled its share of total U.S. earnings, while the bottom 80% of earners is taking home a decreased share of income. CEO pay has risen 725% since 1978. And even business-friendly publications like Forbes and the National Journal acknowledge that inequality is a serious threat to our nation. Yet, and despite improvements in the economy, the unemployment rate for blacks remains persistently high. The last numbers I've seen, as of October last year, unemployment for the entire population had dropped below 8% to 7.9%, but it actually rose for blacks to 14.3%. In a world where disparities like these shock the sensibilities of many, some foundations claim to be neutral. They even assert that their neutrality is an asset or a virtue. But Nobel Peace Prize winner Archbishop Desmond Tutu offered a great observation about neutrality when he said, and I may be paraphrasing a little bit here, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. The lesson could not be truer for us right now. America needs foundations that are willing to directly confront disparities and inequality. If foundations pretend to be neutral, then we are really siding with the rich and the powerful. Part of how we can take the side of the poor and marginalized is by funding in the ways I described previously. But siding with the oppressed also directly relates to the public policy positions that foundations and our trade associations take. If foundation leaders spend their time lobbying against any change to the charitable deduction, but are silent on possible cuts to services for the poor, whose side are we really on? And if foundation leaders are silent about the need to generate tax revenue from those with the greatest ability to pay, whose side are we really on? Our communities need foundations that are not myopically focused on the trees, but instead see the entire forest and act accordingly. Our nation needs foundations that can take policy positions based on what is good for the people and causes that foundations care about, rather than based on what is good for the wealthy donors who create foundations or for the foundations themselves as institutions. We're all in this together. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, during which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. invoked a fierce urgency of now. Half a century later, one might expect America's grant-making institutions to feel a similar sense of urgency. Unfortunately, very few demonstrate that they do. It's clear to me, and I hope also to you, that philanthropy has a unique opportunity to make a difference and to be relevant in this we're all in it together moment. To maximize effectiveness and impact, foundations would be wise to do the three things I've been speaking of: to target grant making to those, to benefit those who need it most, to invest heavily in advocacy and civic engagement strategies, and to side unequivocally with those who have the least power and opportunity and wealth. Thank you.
Well, terrific. Thank you both very much for an opening of clear, contrasting philosophies. And I'm eager for us to have a deeper conversation from a philosophical perspective and actually tackle some specific issues as well. And so at this moment, I just wanted to make sure that if folks have questions that they would like to be asked, please jot them down and hand them over to Nancy, who's over, or Phyllis on this side of the room. And for those who are watching this, please make sure you go online and ask your questions as well. And certainly, I think for the folks online, if you would please also share where you're from, and if you're representing a family foundation, corporate foundation, it would be great to have that perspective as well. So before we get to those questions, we wanted to have Aaron and Bill have an opportunity to respond to one another. So we're going to give them each about 5 to 6 minutes to do so about their openings. And Bill, you started, but I'm going to turn it over to you just because you can have Aaron, you'll have the last word.
Sure, good, yeah. The president's inaugural address, the notion that we're all in this together, is of course a rhetorical mainstay of progressivism in American history. And it suffers from the same difficulty that I was describing libertarian conservatives suffer from. If the world is divided into the radically free individual on the one hand and government on the other, that's the fight we've been. That's the ideological struggle we've been having for many years. And in that battle, it's easy for the left to describe conservatives as social Darwinist, dog-eat-dog, mean-spirited conservatives. And Lord knows we live up to that reputation at every opportunity. We did our best to step into that characterization at every chance in the 2012 election. But that leaves us with this other notion that, you know, when we act together, we act through government, we act through the federal government. We are one grand community, one grand nation. But that has its own problems. It has its own difficulties. The fact of the matter is, no matter how inspiring that vision for one nation is, the government, the programs that are enacted in its name are invariably woefully inadequate to achieve the purposes that they try to achieve, for any number of reasons, not the least of which is any time you set up a government agency, the people that it's going to regulate almost immediately capture that agency and use it for its own purposes. You know, we hear periodically suggestions for having a federal agency to govern or to supervise the nonprofit sector and foundations. Why would we do that? The first thing that would happen would be, you know, the head of one of our major private associations that's the source of the problem would be appointed director of the federal agency. You would, I mean, you know, in what way is that going to solve the problem? It just happens again and again. When we act together, Americans have another way of acting together, and that is through those, as I say, the intermediate associations in civil society. Neighborhoods, voluntary associations, houses of worship, this vast variety of institutions that stand between the radically isolated individual and the central government. Libertarians ignore that, and so do, you know, big government progressives ignore that. But I think that there is, in fact, a way, as I say, for progressives and conservatives to agree on this intermediate level of the importance of this intermediate level of institutions. These institutions are critical for the poor, and I agree, incidentally, with Aaron. I think that if philanthropy can be shown to be entirely a benefit for the rich, and Lord knows it, you know, again, it's doing its best to, you know, to prove that its major gifts go to the institutions that don't really need those gifts, right? I mean, that's what makes the headlines. If philanthropy becomes entirely a self-perpetuating system for the elites, then, you know, it's undermining its own moral authority. It should be about the poor, but the poor will benefit through an America that has a vast variety of powerful civic associations. And incidentally, especially for the foundations in this room, the smaller ones, you know, Aaron is talking about influencing the grand shape of American, you know, social and political systems. You know, if you're Gates, you can do that. If you're a smaller foundation here in San Diego, chances are your ability to dismantle the inequalities of American life are somewhat diminished. But the good news about this other notion, i.e. this strengthening intermediate associations, is that's something that you can do here locally, right? I mean, and it is something that appeals, that has some trans-ideological appeal. I mean, to go back to the Jacobs Foundation here locally, I mean, this is a way they reconcile some ideological tensions, right? It is entirely possible to bring folks together on strengthening local communities. Low-income local communities. That has an appeal to both progressivism and conservatism, as Joe Jacobs said long ago.
Thank you very much, Bill. Aaron, your turn.
Well, one of the things I always love about doing sessions with Bill is that we do both have a critique of the top-down elitist approaches that many foundations take. And one of the unfortunate shortcomings of how our sector operates is that there's very few people willing to criticize or take on foundations. Everyone is always hoping to get that next grant or that next job opportunity, and so people will grumble about these things behind closed doors, but rarely offer the kind of critiques that are necessary to improve our system. In fact, if you want to be a mediocre foundation, you can be a mediocre foundation in perpetuity with almost no repercussions to that. Unlike in business, if you're mediocre, you'll go out of business, or if you're a mediocre politician, you may not get reelected the next time around, although certainly plenty of mediocre politicians do continue to get reelected. So I think one of the things that I didn't mention, but I think is suggested to me by Bill's remarks, is we really need everyone in our sector to begin speaking up more forcefully about, we need a more robust dialogue about these issues. And if you go to certain philanthropic conferences or even look at the publications of philanthropy associations that maybe in years past were critical, it's all fluff now. It's just praise ad nauseum for the great and innovative and thoughtful things that our philanthropies are doing. And I just don't think that serves our sector well. And so, and if it only were true that foundations could get back to what you were talking about, of a focus on who benefits. But when I read the data, the poor are really not the key beneficiaries of foundation largesse. We've done studies on this. Even when you aggregate philanthropy that's intended to benefit a very broad definition of underserved or marginalized communities, we're still less than half of all grant dollars. And that's even if you count grants that are intended to benefit low-income communities, women and girls, people with disabilities. We still only you add them all together and you still only get up to 40% of grant dollars. And so that's part of why I think we've been pushing for this greater intentionality.
Well, guys, thank you very much. We already have a number of questions here from our audience, so please, if you're watching this online, ask your questions, and we'll season this dialogue, I think, as I'm going to take my moderator position to actually just kind of ask a couple questions that we'd preset, but want to jump right into these questions as well. So I'll just quickly start off, though. We are talking about outcomes. We can agree on where we need to actually, what we're trying to achieve. But I want to ask about, let's talk about donor-advised funds for one. Actually, Aaron just kind of raised the question. And when we talk about where the dollars are going in our society and who's actually getting to make those decisions, and with those are some now public dollars, someone might argue, because they are now in the public domain. I'd be curious to hear your perspectives on donor-advised funds, and what's the role of the public in knowing how those funds are being used. Aaron, why don't you start off, and Bill, you can.
Sure. There has been exponential growth in donor-advised funds in this country. It's one of the fastest vehicles, not only at community foundations, but also certainly at the commercial funds like Schwab and Vanguard. It is capturing a large and growing bit of our philanthropic dollars. Part of me is very excited by this. I think it's a nice, easy vehicle for people to maximize their tax benefits, give away some money to charity at the end of the year when the timing is right, and then dole it out. There are, however, some real pitfalls in how we're regulating donor-advised funds. Many donor-advised funds operate more like private foundations without any of the transparency requirements that foundations have. So if you've got an extremely large donor-advised fund held at a grant-making public charity, they could be the biggest grant maker in a community, and no one has to disclose those grants by fund. The parent organization has to disclose all of its grants, but you don't really know where the rest of the money is going. There's also a potential for abuse. There is no payout requirement on donor-advised funds. And in the aggregate, they do very well. But some wealthy individuals can warehouse and do warehouse charitable dollars in donor-advised funds with payouts far, far below the 5% that's required on private foundations. So we've urged some tightening up of those rules to prevent abuses. by and large, it's a positive development. Anything that makes giving easier and more attractive is a good thing, but we need to be careful.
Yeah, I'm entirely on board with the positive aspects of donor-advised funds. I mean, I think you have to understand it as a larger trend, which you see, for instance, in United Way. You know, United Way earmarking of grants rather than just sort of throwing it into the pot has become much more prevalent. I think we have, as a society, become very much less trustful of big institutions, including institutions like United Way, including the large foundations, including the large nonprofits. We are in general much more skeptical about these big institutions. And when we try to give money to them, we are now trying to figure out ways to be pretty certain that it's going where we want it to go. It's very frustrating for the big. It's frustrating for some United Ways. They've been quite vocal about reservations, about earmarked funds. Obviously some community foundations would really like you to just write that check to the community foundation and let the experts downtown decide. But people aren't willing to do that anymore. They really want to have much more of a sense of direct link to the kinds of projects they're supporting. And I think in that atmosphere, incidentally, the notion of supporting low-income civil society groups this is an exciting opportunity for them. These are groups that the big foundations don't have anything to do with. The notion of a small nonprofit submitting a grant proposal to a major foundation is out of the question. But possibly they can attract the attention of a donor-advised fund, or either a private one or at the community foundation. They have a better shot at attracting this kind of support if we have that sort of much more localized and decentralized giving power.
But that's not what's happening. Most donor-advised funds, people contribute to their alma mater and to the hospital that their grandmother was treated at.
Listen, if as I say, if it turns out, in the final analysis, that the money, that charity in America is almost entirely about preserving the status of the elites. Look, I'm a good populist, That's why this is a kind of I'm a screwy conservative in the sense that I'm not going to defend, the big foundations because they're so wonderful. No, the big foundations do a lot of damaging things. I mean, I've pointed out this is the dangerous state to bring this up in, but I'll leap right in and do it anyway. I've been very critical historically of foundations and the fact that they were, the major funders, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Russell Sage, were very big on eugenics, and of course the state of California has quite a record with the eugenics movement, and some foundations here in California were prominent in promoting the eugenics movement. Wealthy foundations can do a lot of damage. And insofar as they are detached from the needs of everyday people, and especially from low-income communities, that the possibility of that damage is increased directly. So, if it turns out that it's all about, Johns Hopkins and Harvard, that's a serious problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so this actually gets to a question around transparency, right? And so we can think about from a perspective around, one is the charitable tax deduction, right? I'd love for you to you've both touched on the topic already, but I want to know if we keep raising the question about the charitable tax deduction, but is that the only tool in the toolbox? Do we really need to have this incentive out there for contributions and donations to be made in public good? Are there other things, and what other suggestions would you both have? Bill, you want to?
Well, let me start on a more philosophical level on this. I mean, foundation dollars in our contention ought to be considered as partially public dollars. because of the tremendous preferential tax treatment that both donors and foundations get. And so because of the tax exemptions, other taxpayers are paying higher rates to make up for the foregone revenue as a result of this system. This is part of what I think puts an extra mandate or impetus on foundations to really actually be benefiting, serving the common good and in ways that are demonstrable. The charitable deduction is not it's not, in my mind, optimized to achieve the results we want. What we're doing right now, in the structure that we have for the charitable deduction, we are subsidizing the charitable choices of the rich, and we are not subsidizing the charitable choices of the poor or the middle class. Only itemizers get to claim the deduction, and people get a higher tax benefit the wealthier they are for their philanthropic gifts. I do think there is an important role for government to incentivize charitable giving. I think that is important. People have great intentions, but you know what? The triggering mechanism and the deadlines of your tax filings force you to actually write the check and get it out the door. I don't want to lose that at all. But a more equitable system might be to switch to either an above-the-line deduction or a tax credit instead, and perhaps with a floor, so that we begin to set this expectation that all Americans ought to be giving at least 2% of their adjusted gross income away to charity, and you get a 15% tax credit, say, on every gift above that. I think that kind of approach would generate more revenue for government and more charitable giving. And it equally subsidizes the charitable choices of wealthy people, working class people, and the like.
Let me just get to this, to the main philosophical argument here, and I don't have any further thoughts on the specifics of how one might improve giving, although in the past conservatives have in fact tried to come up with ways of including non-itemizers in charitable tax breaks. But the notion that the dollars have become public because they're no longer private. Aaron's organization takes that notion and makes it therefore a matter of government concern and government legislation. Where the dollars should go. Just because the dollars are no longer entirely private, just because they're no longer devoted to the self-interest of the donors, doesn't mean that the government therefore has the prerogative of directing those funds however they wish.
And I never said that.
But periodically,
we have never advocated for the government to direct where foundations should put their money.
Well, you've spoken out about you've been supportive of various efforts that would shape the giving stream, shall we say, for the communities that we both are concerned about. But I think you're much more willing to use government to ensure that happening. I mean, AB 624 here in California was one such effort. The notion, for instance, of Congressman Becerra's notion that how did he describe the charitable tax deduction? A $32 billion
earmark.
Earmark, yes. Mm-hmm. The notion that the charitable tax deduction is simply another earmark, and we know how popular earmarks are, in Washington today. See, that's where you end up when you start talking about reshaping the giving stream through government. You end up having massive government, interference in that. And ultimately, the problem there is going to be, of course, that people will say, to heck with it. I am not going to enter into this I'm not going to put my fortune at risk of of getting entangled with yet more federal regulations. My life is full of federal regulations. And the last thing I want to do is to set up a private foundation to pursue my purposes, whatever they are. And, government is now going to tell me who has to sit on my board. I think that's probably going too far. The notion that charitable dollars are not private dollars is absolutely true, but there is this realm of civil society. You see, whenever we keep falling back into this danger of if it's not private, it's government. There's something between the government and the private individual, and it's called civil society. The tax deduction and other measures are designed to preserve the health of that realm of civil society, to protect it. Now, civil society has been ignored in so much of our discourse, and that's sort of what I was trying to get at earlier, and we need to resurrect it. We need to bring back the notion that there is this realm in which charitable dollars exists in some way, not private dollars and yet not government's dollars. But we have to preserve that understanding, and my only complaint about NCRP is that occasionally it goes a little too far toward and therefore government gets to say how you should spend your money. Now he will deny that, but that's...
I'm waiting for the counterpunch now.
Well, we have to disagree about something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, we don't think that government should be dictating, and we've very intentionally said that our recommendations for how to make philanthropy better are things that we want the sector to do voluntarily. It scares me to think about government directing where foundation dollars go, because it certainly won't go to the grassroots groups that are trying to hold government accountable. If government starts directing where our dollars go, they're going to direct philanthropies to replace the spending that government has previously cut. And that's not the kind of philanthropy that I think makes for a vibrant and democratic society. That being said, it is incredibly frustrating for people to see such lofty professed commitment to poor and marginalized communities and so little actual dollars and action that benefits them.
With that last statement, I totally agree. I absolutely agree with that, and as I say, conservative foundations have to do a much better job. If the conservative position is, as it often is, the federal government is doing a terrible job, and civil society, voluntary associations could do a much better job, then conservative philanthropy in particular has an obligation to direct its funding to supporting those kinds of groups, and yet it does not do that. It has failed to do that. The foundation I worked at for a long time, the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee, did a very good job of that. We had although we were supporting these grand public policy organizations in Washington, fully a third of the budget was going to local groups in Milwaukee. And these were $5,000 grants. I mean, we were giving hundreds of thousands of dollars in one check to a group in Washington, and my favorite grant, was always the $5,000 grant to the little group that was 5 miles away.
Let's talk a little bit about intermediate institutions, because we have a question from our audience, actually. Do you see a conservative-liberal divide within the nonprofit sector of intermediate institutions as exists within the political and perhaps philanthropic sphere? And what kind of intermediate institutions do you each admire?
In taking intermediate institutions as synonymous for a moment with nonprofits, I think it's very clear that some of our nonprofits have become so large that they're indistinguishable from government. They are basically government vendors of services. They may have started out one way, but in fact they almost always started out as smaller, in many cases faith-based institutions, but have now become they're now entirely dependent on government or fee for services, which is also a piece of government. And those institutions are, in my view, less interesting and less important for the future of American society than the smaller grassroots civic institutions formed by the neighborhood themselves, by the neighborhood itself, formed by the people who are most directly affected by the problem. Foundations, especially smaller foundations, should be should be searching out those smaller groups that are doing terrific work, out of their own back pocket. United Way has never heard of them. The Chamber of Commerce has never heard of them. The big foundations downtown have never heard of them. They're doing incredible work with almost nothing. And a small or intermediate-sized foundation would do terrific service by tracking down those groups and giving them support. And unfortunately, we tend to get all tangled up in our procedural, complications. How do we measure this? How can we be certain? Choose a group that you can go down and visit and see what they're doing. You don't need metrics, you don't need benchmarks, you don't need 5-year plans, you don't need all of this fancy stuff. That automatically rules out, in many cases, the best nonprofits, because they don't have time for that, they don't understand it. The big nonprofits will be happy to give you a business plan and a 5-year outlook and benchmarks and all that. They're experts at giving you measurable outcomes. But they're not the ones who are really doing the hard work in our poorest communities.
I've been impressed with some of the couple of different kinds of intermediary organizations. When I hear that question, I think of some of the groups that provide really valuable training and technical assistance and help to those smallest grassroots groups. So groups like the Center for Community Change in Washington, D.C. that works with 300 and some grassroots groups, or the National Council of La Raza that has their network of affiliates, or the Leadership Center for the Common Good that's working with groups like that. Those are, I have a real appreciation for some of their work. And on the foundation side, I think some of our community foundations really have done a great job at bridging those divides as well, and they can often be a place to receive grants from larger national foundations and then distribute it and make sure it gets out to groups on the ground. I don't have a great familiarity enough to say whether the San Diego Foundation here is great at that or not, but I know that there are dozens of community foundations that have taken that responsibility on well and have done a good job.
Yeah, many of them are actually joining us by the live stream as well.
Okay.
So we have so many great questions actually from our audience that I'm finding myself more and more as just a conduit to providing you with their questions. This is terrific. So let's move on. How should government and its politicians be held accountable for its spending on social programs? Currently, voting loses to lobbying, transparency loses to spin. What's the new model? Go ahead, Aaron.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's very easy. I have a 3-point plan.
Yes, that's right.
In this era of big money and Citizens United, it is increasingly difficult to actually hold our elected officials accountable. And I think foundations putting some money into the reforming the money in politics stream, I think, is vitally important at this time. And I think funding on the ground grassroots efforts that can, you hold politicians accountable one district at a time. You don't hold them accountable from Washington. So an example of how this played out, I think, was in the fight over the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's often called. One of the greatest contributions to that effort came from philanthropy, where the California Endowment and the Atlantic Philanthropies collectively put tens of millions of dollars into a grassroots coalition called the Healthcare for America Now coalition, over 1,000 grassroots groups. And they had a national strategy, yes, but where they were actually helpful was they had real people on the ground in swing districts where people, where this fight played out. And those grassroots activists were able to really help push that bill over the top, and I think our nation is the better for it.
It's, I'm sure you've read it. Theda Skocpol, sociologist, has a very interesting analysis of this effort and contrasts it with the cap and trade.
Sure, the top-down environmental.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And her point, and I think it's an interesting point, was that cap and trade failed while the Healthcare for America Now succeeded precisely because of this lack of grassroots attachment. And that just leads me to a slightly different point, and that is that, you know, the need to ground your efforts in the grassroots is, I think, the thing that Aaron and I, whatever they are, is, I think, the thing that Aaron and I share. And Theta Scotch-Pole's account of the failure of cap and trade is that it was entirely a technology-driven, top-down, let the experts get together and decide this in Washington, let them, the big business corporations were prepared to play ball, get together with the big environmental organizations, and it had, no grassroots impetus whatsoever. It had a very limited, shall we say, founding in the footing in the grassroots.
Yep.
And that was its problem. So, I think Aaron is right about that. I think, interestingly, on the conservative side, the much maligned, incredibly ludicrous, according to the media, Tea Party notion was, in fact, an embodiment of that. These are everyday citizens, whatever you can say. Granted that some of the work was funded by corporations, but the people themselves turned out. Thousands and thousands of people turned out in this Tea Party movement and brought pressure to bear on politicians at the local level. It was not a creation of the Koch brothers. It was, in fact, a great outpouring of disappointment in the way the federal government is going. So the notion of holding government responsible, I do think we need that is part of the civil society agenda. That is part of that is part of the role it has to play. It needs to be doing some of the things that government is doing, only better, and it needs to bring pressure to bear on government where they're not succeeding.
And I would just add that yesterday we released a new report that looks at this very question of the technocratic or top-down approaches to philanthropy and this decade-long trend that we've had towards strategic philanthropy as it's traditionally understood, and some of its shortcomings and how philanthropy can and must turn to more authentic grassroots involvement in order to mitigate the excesses of strategic philanthropy. The report's called Real Results, and it's on our website.
Yeah, I haven't read that report. I'm looking forward to it, but I think the thing that Aaron and I will both tell you, right, is that as foundations, and you're not going to hear this from a lot of other people, is that all of this reliance on thinking all of these plans through and getting a logic model and getting a chain of theory of change and all. There is so much wind-up in philanthropy today and so little pitch. And it's just unbelievable how much time, and it's now I know that a lot of you probably don't pursue that, but you go to the big associations and this is what you'll hear. You will hear from them that without all this wind-up, you're wasting your money, you're being inefficient, you're not being strategic, you're not being thoughtful enough about what you're doing. Frankly, forget all that. If you're a small local foundation, go out and find somebody who's really doing good work, and how can you tell? Ask the people that they're serving. Ask the people in the neighborhood. The neighborhood elders understand who's doing good work and who the hustlers are. This is not rocket science. It really isn't rocket science. They will tell you. And then write them, start by writing them a small check for general operating support. Don't make their life miserable by quarterly reports and measurements and how are you measuring against your stated goal and so forth and so on. And just, visit them, ask them, drop in on them, check with the people who are around them, that they're working with. This is not hard to do. And foundations are among the very few institutions in American society that have the freedom to do this, incidentally. This is one of the glories of American foundations, because they're so unregulated, is precisely that they have the freedom to go out and do this sort of thing. And yet, you know, left to their own devices, what do? They impose on themselves these incredibly technocratic requirements from, you know, measurable outcomes and business plans and so forth and so on. That resemble nothing so much as government, and you know that's not a good model as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I felt like you were channeling Bill Somerville there for a
yes,
minute.
Yes, that's right, absolutely. Yes,
yeah. You know, one thing you said earlier, Bill, that you sort of brought up again. I don't think it's true, though, that small family foundations can't have an impact on policy issues that matter. No, they're not going to be, it doesn't make sense for them to work on a national campaign, but there are plenty of local grassroots groups advancing really valuable campaigns that advance equity and fairness right in their backyard. Take the living wage movement, for example. That was largely funded by foundations, and jurisdiction by jurisdiction, people stood up and said, you know, if there's government money, if our tax money is going into these projects, we want to make sure that folks are paying a living wage, because you can't live in any city in America on the minimum wage these days. And that movement was funded by foundations and really produced some dramatic improvements in wages, and contributed to then broader minimum wage increases, both at various states and the federal level as well.
And Aaron, would you say that in terms of that just case study, that the issue percolated from the grassroots up, or was that something that the foundations then said, you know, this is a movement we need to be a part of, and then actually drove the dialogue and actually pulled people with them?
Yeah, it was the latter. It came from the grassroots up, and some foundations ultimately came along with it.
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so then, to me, a question to you both is just about, and Bill, you touched upon this, about providing operating support. You know, what is what would you think are the appropriate response from philanthropy when it comes to looking long-term, short-term gains? We've seen where some foundations are looking at, you know, we want to see quick, immediate change versus being in it for the long haul. And how then would our foundations think about, gosh, I've been in this for 5 years. Am I seeing an impact here? Is this the right, should I keep going? Is this now good money after bad money? Or is this like, how do we track the progress that we're trying to achieve in these neighborhoods?
Yeah. I mean, real change takes time, and nonprofits need patient foundation partners who will stick with them with unrestricted multi-year grants over a period of time. It is the number one thing that leads to impact and effectiveness, and nothing more important for foundations to do.
And before you answer that, Bill, the question just then is, do you think there's a trend across the country? Do you think that foundations are doing that or not?
We know there's not a trend across the country.
That's great.
General operating support has remained flat as a percentage of all grants given for more than a decade, and multi-year giving went over a cliff during the economic crisis. We are hopeful that multi-year giving will come back as foundation portfolios recover, but we did reports on that this fall, and no change.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I totally agree clearly with the principle. Multi-year, general operating support, minimal interference with the internal affairs of the nonprofit. Make a very careful selection in the first place, and let that nonprofit, you know, do what it says it's supposed to do. And let me be clear about this. It's not always apparent why this $2,000 had to be spent, you know, to post bail for someone, for instance. But if you know, wait a minute, that's way out of, but as it turns out, you know, that $2,000 posting bail for someone is an incredible affirmation of that nonprofit's standing in the community, an incredible reaffirmation of the link of that nonprofit with the community, almost, you know, far beyond the actual amount of the expenditure. You know, this gesture is absolutely essential for proving that this nonprofit is a piece of the community and participates in the life of the community in a productive way. Viewed from the outside, it looks like corruption. It looks like this is a terrible. I can't believe this. $2,000 you're supposed to be spending it on, the multi-generational child care, blah blah blah, and all that, and that's great. But you, as funders, you have to be able to trust the nonprofit leader really to call the shots on what is important on a day-to-day basis. And that is so hard for foundations, especially given the climate that's encouraged, as I say, by the big trade associations, which is pin the nonprofits down to a very specific set of deliverables and stay on them and make sure that they deliver these measurable results right on time. That is a terrible way to conduct philanthropy. Oh, of course you are.
That's right.
Of course you are.
I have a question here. We've had one question from the live stream, so I think we should honor it and ask it. It's from Elizabeth Ripley. I hear the conservatives in my community say that individuals have surrendered our responsibilities and accountability to government. We rely on government to fix societal problems. But to some extent, haven't people also surrendered this responsibility to these intermediate institutions? Shouldn't we be working on increasing the capacity of the poor and vulnerable and all members of our society to engage, to know and help their neighbors, as opposed to yielding that ownership to intermediate institutions or government?
Bill.
Yeah, well, the intermediate associations I'm talking about are the intermediate associations formed by those people. The notion that a neighborhood is so poor that it can't organize on in its own behalf, I think, is an incredibly short-sighted understanding. If those of you who've worked in the neighborhoods, and I had this experience in Milwaukee, people will say, "Oh, that part of the town is empty of anything good. It's terrible. Nobody wants to fund any project down there because nothing good is happening." And you go down and you talk to the neighborhood leaders and they say, "Well, this drug rehabilitation program is really terrific. It's in a storefront. It's faith-based. But, I know at least 6 young people who've come through that program and are now straight and sober." Well, go and look at that program, and it's not a program it's a program that is formed. It rises out of the needs of the neighborhood itself. I don't think anyone is alone. I mean, I think the division in the inaugural address between the lone individual who can't do anything by him or herself and the only alternative to that is government, that's the problem. I think that is a serious problem. Poor communities have incredible resources, have incredible resilience, have incredible initiative, and it's up to the foundations, the smaller local foundations, medium-sized foundations, to encourage that and to recognize that.
Do you have a comment?
My only quibble would be that that's not what President Obama said in the inaugural, that the only
Run the tape.
individuals can't do anything, and what we need is more government. That's not what I heard in that speech.
Thank you, Ms. Ripley, for that question. Hope other colleagues of yours around the country will actually also join us with some more questions. And I do want to take this to a philosophical 50,000-foot level. One of the hallmarks of what may be known as conservative philanthropy is an understanding and appreciation of the power of moral hazard in human action and the effect of unintended consequences on policies, both in philanthropy and in government action. Could each of you comment?
I do think we need to be aware of unintended consequences. And one of the best ways to mitigate that is by ensuring that regular, everyday people are involved in the development and the design. My experience in 15 years as a community organizer is that when you propose these goofy solutions that sound good to really smart consultants and academics, when you talk that through with someone in the neighborhood, they intuitively know that it's bunk and that it won't work. And so if you keep those folks engaged in your strategy development process and in your decision making, and we urge people to put community folks on the foundation's board, even in a decision-making capacity, you will be far more likely to not pursue initiatives that are going to have undesirable, unintended consequences.
So don't ask them for the theory of change.
Right.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, moral hazard is a notorious problem, especially, of course, for government programs. I mean, the difficulty, the general problem with government and moral hazard has been that government looks at a so-called distressed neighborhood and begins to move into it. And in the process, it ends up elbowing aside the institutions that are there, that are solving the problems, however haphazardly. From the outside world, it looks like they're not being solved, but they are being solved in some way, And our best bet would be to strengthen those institutions that are there. Instead, we end up undermining them, attaching more and more people to the government programs themselves, even though they're not very good programs. They're terrible programs, but people would prefer to stick with those programs than to be left abandoned altogether, which is, of course, that was, the Republican Party in 2012 did its best to make the American people think that was its plan, right? I mean, the only alternative to a lousy federal program is nothing at all. But the moral hazard problem is a huge problem, and the virtue of philanthropy in that area is, of course, that it can recognize that and move very quickly against that problem, as opposed to government that has no ability to deal with it whatsoever.
So we are in a border town, so it's, I think, appropriate that I ask this question, and I hope our colleagues in Iowa, in landlocked Iowa, also appreciate it. But what's your ideal, for both of you, what's your ideal use of philanthropic dollars to support the quality of life of the 11 million illegal, undocumented residents in the United States?
You want to go first on this one?
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think in general that issue is about to be settled in a way that's by and large favorable. And then I think it again here, this is going to be a powerful test of philanthropy. Are we in fact willing to go to those communities, right, and say to them, look, you really do, you really have the capacity to, or you've proven, right, that you have the enormous ingenuity and energy, and now it really is up to you guys to organize your communities in such a way that they fit your needs. And philanthropy has the resources and the flexibility to do that sort of thing. And incidentally, I think this is, well, I'll leave it at that.
So I'm hopeful that your statement is correct, that we are indeed on the cusp of the solving part of this problem. It certainly appears that's right. If it's true, part of the credit needs to go to the philanthropies that over the last decade have been investing in a robust grassroots immigrant rights movement. You've got people like Jerry Mannion at the Carnegie Corporation in New York, and many, many, many other foundations who have been investing in immigrant communities themselves to be speaking out about how these policies impact their own lives. The incredible courage and creativity of the dreamers, the young people whose parents brought them into the country and when they were quite small, and who find themselves after high school suddenly realizing they don't have proper documentation. Those people, their courage to come out of the closet and advocate on their own behalf and say, yeah, I'm undocumented and I'm American. I'm part of this. I'm part of the fabric of this community. I think that that kind of activism really helped to put us in this moment, and the voter engagement efforts of other nonprofits. There's a California Forward effort here that's been ensuring voter registration and participation from low-income immigrant communities. I think those kinds of efforts all across the country contributed to this massive turnout from Latino communities, and it was because of how the votes broke from Latino communities that Republicans have finally been willing to come to the table on an issue that they avoided over the last decade.
Bill, there's a number of things that Aaron said that I think you might want to respond to, actually. And let's start with just one of those being about voter registration and the role of philanthropy in that aspect, as opposed to just providing like direct services to achieve improvement in individual lives, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, foundations have, they did it. There's no question philanthropy did a terrific job on this issue. I mean, the foundations that set out to work on that did a terrific job. And I'm hoping that the conservative movement understands that the way to attract Hispanic voters is through this, renewal of interest in civil society. I mean, I truly am hoping that the message of the harm of central government, that the intrusiveness, the oppressiveness of a large central government, will be that the argument against that will be made now not in the name of a radically free, isolated individual, as it so often is, but rather will be made in the name of healthy and vigorous intermediate associations, which have traditionally always had a strong ethnic basis as well as a faith basis. I mean, right, the great story of America is a story of immigration and the story of ethnic groups working among themselves, right, setting up their own savings banks, setting up their own burial societies, setting up their own institutions, which incidentally were in many cases held in very low regard by our big foundations originally. Rockefeller and Russell Sage, all those guys. This was beneath contempt as far as the big foundations were concerned. But this is the local community expressing itself according to its own lights and meeting its own needs its own way. And the ethnic basis of that, I think, is absolutely, totally American. I mean, I think that is the fact that, that you have groups organizing themselves according to that, as well as according to faith. These are all, even though they look divisive, to some conservatives, it looks divisive, but it isn't divisive. This is how we come together. This is how we're all in it together. We're not all in it together as one vast national glob. We're all in it together through all of these groups that we form, and through which we work together immediately and directly with each other in face-to-face endeavor to solve problems in front of us.
Okay, here's another question from the audience. If the poor are the who of philanthropy, what's the what? What's the goal? And how do we know we've succeeded or at least made progress? More metrics and theory of change.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. This is exactly our answer.
Look, the Declaration of Independence talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we have lots of different ways we can look at those things. But ultimately, every individual deserves the opportunity to live a full, fulfilling life, and to the extent that philanthropy can contribute to that in serious ways, that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think, again, I think that this is not as complicated as we make it, the notion of how we understand ourselves to be progressing. We're fooling ourselves if with all our metrics that we're actually able to establish and drive progress. I think that's entirely false, because so much impacts the notion of poverty in America, so much affects it that's well beyond the reach of foundations. Foundations can only touch a very small part of this. And the notion that if you set up a metric and hold people accountable to outcomes, that you're going to drive this issue and you're going to solve the problem, I think is just foolish. I think you're wasting your own time, and I especially think you're wasting the time of your grantees. I think you just have to make the grants to the groups that you, in your judgment, are doing the good work, and visit them. You know, talk to them, ask it, be out of the, Bill Somerville is not a bad model in this regard. Get out of the office, right? What does he say? Spend 75% of your time out in the field and, 25% at your desk. I think that's good advice. And don't get, there's no way of knowing that you're going to, quote, make progress against poverty, because we have no idea what kinds of massive institutional structural things are going to crash down on this country. All you can do is be faithful to the groups that are doing good work now, stick with them over the long haul, and rely on their judgment about what is to be done in these particular circumstances. Yeah. To describe it as poverty, as in a vast general term, is automatically and already to abstract from the practical, immediate experience that we're dealing with.
And I agree with much of what Bill said about metrics, but I do think we need to pay attention to the data at many points, and it's helpful. If you completely ignore the data, many of the disparities that I was talking about in my opening remarks go unnoticed. If you're not checking on how race and poverty are intersecting, you're going to miss the ability to make a difference for certain people. You would have said in October, oh good, unemployment's going down, we're doing better. It's at 7.9%, when we've actually got an incredible crisis in black communities around the country on this, and some greater targeted interventions are desperately needed.
Can I just insert one thing? I was just glancing at tweets, and Bill Gates might be listening in, because he just weighed in on his tweet. It says, I've been struck again and again how important measurement is to improving life. Yeah. I kid you not, hot off the press from Bill himself.
Wow.
Right.
So, let's talk about efficiencies. We've talked about efficiencies and inefficiencies in philanthropy and in government. This pointed question is, for all the criticism of the effectiveness of foundation philanthropy, please address the relative effectiveness of government spending to solve these same problems. Who would decide which foundations are mediocre? Who gets to define mediocre? Aaron, I'm going to want you to start with this one.
Yeah, I think that one was directed more at me. So the relative effectiveness of philanthropy and government is an interesting question. But the two are on a completely different scope and scale. I mean, this is why we urge the leveraging of philanthropic dollars in support of advocacy activities as a part of it. You look at our education system. The last time I ran some numbers, I believe that we are at well over 1,000 to 1 on dollars spent by government on education versus dollars spent by philanthropy on education. And on every issue that you look at, it's just, philanthropic dollars are a drop in the bucket. So I think the question is not which is a better way to meet the needs of the society, but rather what's the proper role of government in a healthy democratic society, and how can philanthropy be a complement to that, not a substitute for it? I think that's a fundamentally important way to look at it. As for who gets to decide what a mediocre foundation is or isn't, I'm actually a big believer in the wisdom of the group discourse and dialogue. When there are a lot of voices weighing in, if people were more courageous and if we had mechanisms for greater truth-telling in philanthropy, I think it becomes clearer what's great and what's mediocre. And so, to my mind, a lot of our activities are designed to increase robust discussion, debate, and dialogue, because out of that, we think that makes philanthropy better.
Bill.
Yeah, I have upset my conservative allies from time to time by not falling down at the altar of donor intent and saying that whatever the donor wants to do, the donor should get to do, and because that tends, in my mind, to lead to this notion of, well, therefore the donor shouldn't be criticized, right? I mean, the donor should be able to do whatever he or she wants, and the rest of us have no business criticizing it because it's not our money. Now, I understand that there's a certain, bottom line aspect to that. But frankly, we do need to criticize foundations. And who decides? Well, we need to have that conversation. We need to have that debate. We decide that question by going back and forth. We decide that question by writing up foundation programs, not numerically. Come on. Everybody knows of at least 10 foundation initiatives that were rolled out, in your own backyard, that were rolled out with great fanfare, and this is going to change the face of poverty in San Diego, and this is going to be great, everything's going to be great. And it just slowly died and faded away, and nobody said a thing. This is extraordinary. This is the only sector in America where we would permit this sort of thing to happen. If it were a political initiative, you could count on some political opponent to say, what did you do with that tax, what did you do with that money? Or if it were a business, you could count on some other business, obviously, to capitalize on the failure of this one to deliver. But in philanthropy, we just let these big, huge initiatives be launched, and then we kind of just let them die, and nobody says anything. This is extraordinary. It's absolutely unprecedented to have a sector this size and to have such an incredibly limited, constrained, frail public discourse about the results. And as I say, I don't mean measurable results. I mean just let's have an honest conversation. What did happen to that initiative? Occasionally a newspaper will follow up. But by and large, as you know, and this is data on this actually, that the favorable to unfavorable, the stories, the proportion of stories on foundations in the press that are favorable versus unfavorable are something like 20 to 1. I mean, it's just there's no comparison. The newspapers will print the press releases from the foundation, but will never follow up on that basis. And we need to have that conversation to hold foundations much more accountable. And that means that some of you guys are going to have to be funding efforts to have that conversation. I mean, I hate to say it, but NCRP does a very good job of raising questions about philanthropy. And Aaron is in the, what is it, biting the hand that feeds us for, 20 years, whatever.
37 years.
37 years now, biting that hand for a long time. It's essential for these institutions to be funded because they are the ones that promote this discourse that's otherwise completely absent.
Thank you. I'll give you a nice cut of
yes, I expect that $25 after this.
Unfortunately, we've come to that time where we're about out of time, but we wanted to make sure that you each had 3 minutes to provide any final words, thoughts that from this discussion, things that you want us to take away all across the country. Bill, since you got a chance to start, Aaron, why don't you begin?
I think we do have I think this next several years is going to be a time of great opportunity in this nation. I think some things that have been stuck or impossible for a very long time may in fact become possible, and foundations have an opportunity, a chance to be part of creating some very positive change in local communities and in our nation. And to do that and to succeed, the things I was recommending before, make sure you're targeting your grant dollars so that the most vulnerable are benefiting from it. Make sure you're taking some risks and boldly investing in some advocacy efforts that you don't know whether it's going to succeed or not, but give the groups a chance, and I think we might be surprised at what can happen. And unrestricted dollars, so the groups have the flexibility to react to changing conditions on the ground. Those are ways that foundations can really be relevant and a part of making change. There are lots of great resources in philanthropy, so if you're having trouble finding the right thing that helps you have this conversation with others in your foundation, you can certainly look to our website or send me an email and I can direct you to someone else's great resource that will help you move that conversation in your own institution. Because in my experience, the only way things evolve or change in a positive direction in a foundation is when one person on the staff or on the board says, you know what, I really think we need to head in this direction, and they take it upon themselves to move that conversation forward with their colleagues.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah.
Bill?
Good, yeah. Well, I'll just go back to my original point, which is I think that in this realm of local institutions, smaller community associations, religious and ethnic groups, and so forth, I think here there is a surprising overlap between progressive philanthropy and conservative philanthropy, and progressivism and conservatism in general. You know, I think that going forward, as I said at the outset, we simply aren't going to be able to pay for a lot of the discretionary programs that we've paid for in the past. That's just a fact. It isn't me, it isn't Romney, it isn't, Paul Ryan. It's just a fact that our entitlement obligations are massive. They're not necessarily targeted to the poor, and they are going to squeeze out other parts of the domestic agenda. So we are going to, whether this isn't a case of philanthropy being assigned to pick up the pieces. It's a case of philanthropy having to innovate in the wake of this retreat of government from so many of these areas that they've spent domestic funds on. And in the course of that, I think there is some exciting possibilities of, progressivism and conservatism working together with local groups that are doing good things, conspicuously good things for low-income people. I would, again, Aaron is going to have to fight some, he's going to have to fight some battles, and progressives are going to have to fight some battles with some interest groups within your own camp who are going to be first at the trough. They are not going to permit their funded obligations to be pushed aside. When conservatives say something about that, we're just being mean-spirited jerks. So it's going to be up to some progressives, right? And you've had some of this in California, right? You've had some progressive mayors who have had to say to public sector unions, look, guys, the services are suffering for the poor. The services are really because we're funding pensions instead of services, and this is a fight for conservatism, for progressivism. But it's going to be, conservatives are going to have that fight within our ranks as well, and it is our duty. The mediating structures conservatives, all three of us, have quite a I hope the Jacobs Foundation is there with us, but we have quite a barrier to overcome ourselves, and we're going to have to take on some of our allies.
I think you just could have conceivably kicked off another hour-long conversation, and what I hope is that we don't end this conversation, that if you do tweet, don't forget it's #CivilDiscourse, and I just have to say, if Mr. Gates has time to tweet about this discussion, I think we might all across the country have an opportunity to do that as well. And I'd like to just turn it over to Nancy to conclude the conversation.
Just take a round of applause.
Yep.
Yeah. So I told you I had a dream about this, and this dream was as good in reality as imagined. I think it was a terrific conversation. So thank you very much to Sid and Bill and Aaron for coming our way and making this happen in San Diego. And we did have some folks listening on across the country, so I was happy and honored to have done that. I want to thank Northern California Grantmakers and Southern California Grantmakers for making the live feed in this program possible. We are together California Philanthropy and in support of your needs and your colleagues across the state. I want to thank the staff back there in the corner, yay staff, for making all this happen. Justin, Phyllis, and Michelle. And our board of directors. Could the board of directors raise their hand? We have a number of them here. And advisory board members, raise your hand. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I thank our guests from the internet. You will, as is typical fashion for regional association programs, get a post-game analysis opportunity, an evaluation. And of course, the video will be on our website in a couple of days if all goes well. And our next program is on February 19th, and we are speaking with a vice president from the Boston Foundation named Robert Lewis, who's well known for his work in civic engagement, actually, and in working with boys and men of color, as well as doing gun violence prevention and gang work. And he'll be here to talk about their work and how it fits in San Diego as well, February 19th. And so go forth, do good work, whatever you decide that is after hearing today, what you should do. And we're here to help you as well. Thank you, and everybody have a good day. Oh, you know what? I do have one question from that we didn't read. Is would the speakers be willing to make their prepared notes available? Is that doable, or?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so we will make sure those are available for you as well. Thank you.